They said it was just a drive to clear their heads, but the moment my mother unbuckled her seatbelt and turned around, I knew. Her eyes didn't blink, her voice didn't shake. "Mara, this is where we leave you." The rain hit the windshield like fingertips drumming for the truth. My father didn't look back. He just opened my door, dropped the backpack on the wet asphalt, and whispered, "You'll figure it out." I stood there, 36 years old, soaked through a cotton hoodie I hadn't washed in weeks. My fingers trembled harder than usual, not from the cold but from the betrayal. The same hands they once held when I had my first seizure. They got in the car. They drove off. The red brake lights blinked like a warning, then disappeared. That's when I screamed. Not their names, just noise. Raw cracking noise no one heard on that empty Washington road. Mud seeped through my sneakers. My teeth clattered. The backpack they gave me. A bottle of water. 2 granola bars. And my expired insurance card. No phone, no ID, no note. Just the echo of my mother saying, "You're not our responsibility anymore." I tried walking, but my legs folded. The tremor in my hands spread to my knees. I collapsed beside a ditch and let the rain hide my tears. Would they even tell Ethan, or had he already vanished forever? That's when I saw the headlights, bright, steady. Coming back number, not them. Someone else. A truck slowed. The door opened. A familiar voice cut through the storm. "Mara, get in." I looked up. Ethan, older, wilder. Eyes full of something I hadn't seen in years. Fire. He wrapped me in a flannel blanket that smelled like pine smoke and old books. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. That night, in a cabin lit by a single oil lamp, I would learn everything about our parents. Their lies. The trial that ruined me before I even knew my name was on a list. But in that moment, all I could whisper was, "Why now?" He just stared at the flames. They were never going to save you. Would you fight back or walk away? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever walked away when you needed them most? Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of justice, closure, and empowerment after 35. Before they abandoned me in the rain, they left me slowly. Quietly, like a faucet dripping until there was nothing left. It began with glances that didn't meet mine. Then the birthday cards turned generic, and my name, Mara, their daughter, started to feel like a burden wrapped in syllables. I used to believe our home in Spokane was safe. Not warm exactly, but safe. Robert always sat in his recliner by 7 p.m. watching whatever cable news would numb him. Linda balanced our finances at the kitchen counter surrounded by her spreadsheets and the faint scent of peppermint gum. I made dinner most nights, mostly casseroles, the kind that stretched through Thursday. Back then I was still working full-time at the graphic design firm. The tremors had just begun. Barely a flick in my fingers, like a secret no one had discovered yet. I hid it at first. Tucked my right hand into my coat pocket, pretended it was caffeine or exhaustion. Pretended everything. But one morning I dropped a client's portfolio. Spilled coffee on a conference table. And when I got home, Linda was already waiting. Her eyes were tight, jaw clenched. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked if I'd been drinking. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I apologized. That became the rhythm. Me apologizing for symptoms. For costs. For simply existing. Ethan noticed first. He came home for a long weekend that winter. Took one look at my shaking hand over dinner and said, "Something's wrong with her. She needs help." Robert called it dramatizing. Linda said I was just tired. And Ethan, God bless him, slammed the door and drove off into the snow. I didn't see him again for years. After he left, I stopped correcting people. Stopped asking questions at doctor visits. Stopped believing I was worth more than the insurance form they made me sign each January. The tremors got worse. I lost weight. Sometimes I'd cry in the laundry room with the dryer running just so they wouldn't hear. Linda cut the cable. Robert sold the second car. Every cost got streamlined and I felt myself shrinking with each necessary sacrifice. Once I opened the fridge and found a note taped to a block of cheese: "Do not eat. Special order." I stood there holding the door and whispered to myself, "I'm not even worth a sandwich." And I believed it. In the spring of 2020, the tremors moved to my left hand. I remember spilling orange juice on the keyboard. Not once, twice in the same week. My manager at the firm tried to be kind, but I could see the shift behind her eyes. The tilt of concern edging toward liability. They let me go quietly. "Restructuring," they said. "COVID has impacted everyone." I nodded, mask on, dignity off. When I told my parents, Linda didn't blink. She asked how long my severance would last. Robert muttered something about dead weight. That night, I lay on the couch with an ice pack pressed to my wrist. Not from an injury, just a need to feel something sharp and cold. Something real. We weren't poor. But I could feel the scarcity in the way Linda counted every dollar, tapping her calculator so hard the kitchen table shook. She started watching YouTube videos about early retirement and cutting financial fat. Apparently, I was fat. She installed spending alerts on my debit card. If I bought something over $10, she'd text, "Was this necessary?" So I stopped buying coffee. Stopped getting haircuts. Stopped leaving the house. She replaced my shampoo with a cheaper brand. Switched my medication to a generic that made me dizzy. Every corner of that house whispered, "You cost too much." Robert built a storage shelf in the garage and moved my boxes out of the hall closet. Said he needed space for tools. I hadn't seen him use a wrench in 5 years. One day I heard Linda on the phone with a cousin in Idaho. "I just don't know what to do with her anymore," she said. "She's not getting better." She paused, lowered her voice. Then I heard something that made me sit down right on the hallway floor. "She's not contributing. She's just there." I stared at the family photo on the hallway wall. Thanksgiving 2012. Ethan still had braces. I wore a red dress and a real smile. I stood up, took it down, and flipped it face first against the wall. A week later, Linda locked the fridge with a child-proof latch. Said it was for portion control. I was 35. Robert bought a motion light for the hallway. Every time I got up at night, it flashed like an interrogation. I started to tiptoe. Even in my own home. And when I found a post-it on my bedroom door that read, "Dr. Bildu," I knew. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a debt they hadn't figured out how to erase yet. It was a Thursday when Linda knocked on my bedroom door. She didn't come in, just hovered, her voice filtered through the wood like smoke. "Mara," she said, "your uncle in Boise has a guest room. Maybe a change of scenery would help." I sat up in bed, clutching the blanket like armor. "A few weeks," she added. "Just until we catch up on things." I waited for the part where she said, "We love you." It never came. I didn't ask questions, didn't beg. Didn't remind her of the nights I stayed up making soup when Robert had the flu, or the time I handled their taxes while tremoring through every number. Instead, I started packing. I chose my warmest sweater. My sketchbook. The framed photo of Ethan and me at age 10 wearing Halloween capes and crooked smiles. Linda stood in the doorway as I zipped my bag. "You'll be okay," she said, as if she were giving me a gift. But the look in her eyes, relief, not concern. Robert didn't even say goodbye. He pretended to be asleep on the recliner, the television blaring a game he wasn't watching. They dropped me off at the Greyhound station the next morning. The sky was clear. The air smelled like burnt coffee and car exhaust. Linda handed me a paper envelope. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was money. Inside, a grocery list. "Foods low in sodium and sugar," she had written. "Don't embarrass us." The driver took my ticket without looking. I found a seat in the back row and sat down hard. My knees ached, my fingers twitched. The bus pulled away and I watched the only house I'd ever lived in shrink in the mirror. I didn't cry. I stared out the window as miles of frozen road unfolded. My reflection trembled in the glass. Somewhere in Idaho, the driver stopped for gas. I stepped off, leaned against a vending machine, and felt the full weight of absence. Not just of home, but of being wanted. That night I arrived in Boise. No one met me. No one called. I sat on a bench near the terminal clutching my backpack like it might dissolve too. I whispered Ethan's name just once into the cold. He didn't answer. Not yet. Boise was quieter than I remembered. Uncle Jim's guest room smelled like mothballs and lemon floor cleaner. The sheets were stiff. The clock ticked too loud. He barely spoke to me except to say grace before dinner and remind me to keep the thermostat low. I didn't mind. Silence was easier than pretending. I spent my days on the back porch with a blanket watching squirrels dart across the fence line. My sketchpad stayed mostly blank. My hands trembled too much for lines. But I still carried it with me like an old habit I hadn't buried yet. Each week Linda sent a short email, no greeting, no signature. Just lines like remember to apply for Medicaid. Or, did you refill your tremor meds? I never replied. What was there to say? In November, Ethan emailed me out of nowhere. Just one line. I heard what they did. I'm sorry. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. I wanted to reply. To tell him about the hallway light, the sticky note on the fridge, the ache of being unloved by the people who made you. But I didn't. I just wrote, where did you go? His answer came the next morning. Off-grid. Cabin. Northern Idaho. I needed to get away. Then nothing for days. Until one night I opened my inbox and found an attachment. No subject line. No message. It was a scan of a check. $7,000. Made out to our parents. Memo line insurance deposit Neurovant study. I stared at it. For a long time. Then the second file came through a screenshot of a message from Linda to someone named Dr. Helen R. I read the first line twice. We agreed not to mention the tremors began before dosage. That was the deal. My stomach turned. My fingers went numb. I reread it. Again. And again. They knew. They knew what caused it, and they let me think it was just me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with the light off, the soft hum of the fridge behind me, the sound of a neighbor's wind chime tapping the dark. I whispered Ethan's name again, not into the cold this time, into the glow of my laptop screen. And this time he answered. Ethan pulled up in a beat-up pickup just past midnight. I heard the engine before I saw the lights, a low familiar growl that made my chest ache. He didn't honk, didn't text, he just waited. I stepped out with nothing but my sketchpad, my meds, and a fleece jacket I hadn't worn since college. The porch light flickered. Uncle Jim didn't come to the door, he rarely did. Ethan stepped out of the truck. He looked older but not broken. His beard was full, his hair longer, and his eyes, those same gray eyes, carried something I couldn't name. Weight. Fire. Guilt. He didn't hug me, not at first. He just opened the passenger door and said, "Get in." We drove for 3 hours in silence. The road snaked through dark hills, past sleeping towns and shuttered gas stations. He had the heat on high. I kept my hands buried in my sleeves. Somewhere near Bonner's Ferry, he finally spoke. They took the money, he said. $7,000 to let a drug company test on you. I turned toward the window. I figured. He gripped the wheel tighter. I didn't, not then. He paused. I left because of it. That night Dad yelled at me. He said I was ungrateful. That I didn't understand sacrifice. Turns out I understood too well. I didn't reply. I didn't have words for the kind of betrayal that sinks so deep it lives in your marrow. We reached the cabin near 4 a.m. It stood alone, tucked between pine trees, a crooked chimney puffing lazy smoke into the dark. He helped me out slowly. My legs were stiff. My fingers shook. Inside it smelled like cedar and dust. The fire was already going. A cast-iron kettle steamed quietly on the stove. There were no framed pictures, no clutter. Just a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of old books, and a single cot with thick blankets. He handed me a cup of tea. No words, just steam and silence. I took a sip and let it burn all the way down. That was the first time I slept through the night in over a year. In a room with no locks, no lists, no conditions, only warmth. And the quiet hum of someone who hadn't given up on me. Not yet. The next morning Ethan handed me a flash drive. "It's all here," he said. "Everything I've found. Bank records. Emails, a few recordings." I stared at it. So small. So ordinary. And yet it felt heavier than my body had in years. We sat at the small table. He opened his laptop, the screen cracked in one corner. First a folder labeled Neurovance Trial, 2017. There was a consent form. Signed by Linda. Not me. I leaned in. At the bottom, a forged signature. Mine. My stomach turned. She had written the M in my name with a curl. I always printed it straight. Next, an email thread. Linda to a woman named Dr. Helen Reed. The tremors started after the dosage. As agreed. "We understand the confidentiality clause. The funds will help with long-term care." Long-term care. They kicked me out and called it a solution. Then Ethan played the dashcam clip. It was from the night they left me. Rain splattered the windshield. Linda's voice cut through the static. "She won't survive out here." Robert replied. "That's not our problem anymore." The camera shook slightly as the car came to a stop. I watched myself on screen, trembling, stepping out slowly, trying to speak. They drove away. My hand flew to my mouth. Ethan paused the video. "You don't have to watch this," but I did. I needed to see it. All of it. No more guessing. No more wondering if I had imagined the cruelty. No more excusing it as fear or stress or tough love. It was real, documented. Unforgivable. I leaned back in the chair, letting the cold from the wooden seat settle into my spine. The fire crackled in the background. Outside, snow began to fall in lazy spirals. Ethan sat across from me. Quiet. Still. Waiting. "I'm tired of hiding," I whispered. He nodded slowly. "Then, don't. We can fight this. I've been building a case." I met his eyes. "I want justice," I said. "But I want truth more." He exhaled sharply. "That's exactly what they're afraid of." In that cabin, surrounded by smoke and silence and the weight of years unloved, I made a choice. To stop being the quiet one. The burden. The erased. I would find Dr. Helen Reed. I would speak. Even if my voice shook. Especially if it did. We found Dr. Helen Reed in a directory for delicensed researchers. A quiet little website, no photos, no contact form. Just an Idaho P.O. box and a single sentence. Former clinical pharmacologist. No longer affiliated with Neurovance or any of its partners. Ethan printed it out, circled the address, and slid it across the table. "I think she's hiding," he said. I didn't blame her. If I'd once approved a trial that shattered bodies for profit, I'd hide too. Still, we wrote a letter. 4 pages. Typed. I told her everything: the tremors, the trial, the forged consent form, the abandonment. We mailed it on a Thursday morning. By Friday night, I had memorized every word I'd written and hated every one of them. What if she never answered? What if she did and lied again? "What are you expecting?" Ethan asked, pouring coffee. I shrugged. Not an apology, maybe just to hear someone say I'm not crazy. He didn't say anything to that. 2 weeks passed, then a manila envelope arrived. No return address. Inside, a handwritten letter in tight slanted script. "Dear Miss Thompson, I know who you are. And I know what they did." My hands began to shake, but not from the illness. From rage. From vindication. From the cold weight of almost being believed. She continued, "The compound tested on you is known to induce motor disruptions in primates. We flagged it, twice. But we were told the human trials had been pre-cleared by outside counsel." I voiced my objections. I was told to take early retirement, and paid to stay silent. The letter ended with a note: "If you ever choose to go public, I will stand with you." I looked up at Ethan. He was already moving, pulling binders from the shelf, stacking receipts, organizing printed emails, his expression calm but burning. I clutched the letter like scripture. Someone else knew. Someone inside. Someone willing to risk her own name. Suddenly, the tremors didn't feel like shame anymore. They felt like proof. They weren't my weakness, they were evidence. And somewhere out there, the people who had taken everything from me, my health, my family, my dignity, still thought I was too sick to speak. They had no idea how loud I was about to become. We drove into Sandpoint the next day, a binder full of copies strapped in the backseat like a passenger. Ethan had a list: reporters, legal clinics, even 2 podcast producers who specialized in whistleblower cases. I had my cane, and a sense of dread that clung to my ribs like wet wool. Our first stop was a local paper. Small town but real. They listened. Sort of. The editor, a balding man who kept checking his phone, skimmed our documents. "You have a lot of emotion here," he said, like it was a weakness. "Do you have any official diagnosis connecting your condition to the drug?" I didn't respond. Ethan leaned forward, steady. "We have internal emails, forged documents, a medical professional willing to testify." The man nodded. "But no official lawsuit. No public records yet." He closed the folder gently, like tucking away something too messy to touch. "I'm sorry. It's a liability without more." Outside, I stared at the sidewalk, heart pounding. "Maybe this was a mistake," I whispered. Ethan didn't answer. Just opened the truck door and tossed the binder in like it had burned him. We drove in silence. Again. That night, I stood on the porch of the cabin watching a raccoon dig through the compost bin. The cold stung my cheeks. I didn't go back inside. I didn't want Ethan to see me cry. But he knew. Of course he knew. Because the next morning he was gone. I found a note on the table: meeting someone in Coeur d'Alene. Might have better luck there. Back by dinner. He didn't come back by dinner. Or breakfast. Or the next night. At 2 a.m. someone banged on the cabin door. I grabbed my cane, heart hammering. It wasn't Ethan. It was a deputy. "Ma'am, your brother's been arrested. Possession of unauthorized surveillance equipment, possible violation of privacy statutes." I blinked. "What?" The man shrugged. "Says he was gathering evidence, something about a pharmaceutical company. But he crossed some lines." I felt my knees weaken. "Where is he?" "Bonner County Jail. You can call in the morning." He left a business card. I sat on the floor, the silence around me suddenly louder than ever. Ethan was gone. The only person who knew everything. The only one who stayed. And I was alone. Again. I didn't sleep that night. Not a minute. I sat at the kitchen table, Ethan's coffee mug still half full, his boots by the door, laces tangled. I wrapped myself in one of his jackets. The sleeves were too long. The smell, pine soap, something faintly metallic, hit me like a memory I hadn't earned. He had warned me once. They'll fight dirty. Especially when you're close to the truth. And now he was behind bars for trying to protect mine. The next morning, I called 3 lawyers. No one picked up. One voicemail said, "We do not handle pharmaceutical defense or whistleblower-related litigation." I tried the newspaper again. This time they didn't take my call. I made a cup of tea. Spilled half of it from my shaking hand. And then I opened my laptop. I stared at a blank email window for almost 30 minutes. Then I typed, "My name is Mara Thompson. I was abandoned by my parents after they enrolled me in an illegal drug trial. My brother is in jail for trying to prove it. I have documentation, testimony, and a voice. If you're willing to listen." I sent it to 17 newsrooms. Statewide, national. Even one international. Then I closed the laptop. And waited. By nightfall, 2 reporters replied. One wanted more context. The other asked if I'd be willing to go on record. Live. I stared at the message. My hand hovered over the keyboard. Live. I thought of my parents' last words. Linda's cold voice. "You're not our responsibility anymore." Robert's silence. The empty chair at every family holiday. I thought of Ethan behind a concrete wall holding on to the same truth no one else dared to name. I hit reply. Yes. I'm ready. I didn't feel brave, I felt sick, exposed. But underneath it something steadier pulsed. Anger, resolve, truth. I packed my bag that night, the letter from Dr. Reed, the binder of evidence, my sketchpad with Ethan's name scribbled in the corner, and my cane. I would walk into that studio trembling. But I would not walk in silent. They wanted me to disappear. To be forgotten. To be a medical footnote in someone else's profit margin. But I still had a voice, and this time I wouldn't let it shake. The green room smelled like old makeup and nerves. I sat beneath bright bulbs, cane resting against my knee, watching a makeup artist dab concealer beneath my eyes. She smiled gently but didn't ask questions. Maybe she wasn't allowed to. Maybe she just knew what trauma looked like up close. The studio was colder than I expected. Everything sterile. The floor too polished, the silence too curated. A producer handed me a clipboard. Quick rundown. You'll be on after the commercial break. Host will ask basic questions, then open to follow up. I nodded. She paused. You sure you want to do this? It's a big audience. Some pushback, possibly. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling again. But this time I didn't hide them. Yes, I said. I'm sure. The host gave me a polite smile as they mic'd me up. Behind her a screen read "One Woman's Fight Against Medical Betrayal." I almost laughed. It sounded dramatic. Too clean for what I had lived through. I adjusted my seat. They counted down from 5, and then I was live. Can you tell us, Mara, the host began, when did you first realize something was wrong? I took a breath. My hands, I said softly. They started shaking when I was 26. At first it was small. Then I couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling. My parents. They told me it was stress. I paused. But what I didn't know then, what I only learned years later, was that they had enrolled me in a trial, without my consent, for a drug called neurovance. Gasps echoed behind the camera crew. I continued. They forged my signature, they took money. And when my symptoms worsened, when the drug began showing what it really did to my body, they left me. On a back road. In the rain. Silence. I turned toward the host, who seemed to be holding her breath. My brother found me. He dug for the truth, and when he got close, he was arrested. I held up the letter from Dr. Helen Reed. She was on the trial team. She confirmed everything. The risks were flagged. They were silenced. I won't be. The lights felt hotter now. But my voice didn't crack. It didn't matter if the audience believed every word. I wasn't there for applause. I was there to say it finally. To stop carrying the shame they handed me. To hand it back. The segment went viral overnight. By morning my inbox was flooded. Some messages were kind strangers sharing stories of misdiagnosis, of being gaslit by family, of feeling erased. Others weren't kind. They called me a liar. A scammer. Said I was exaggerating for attention. But I didn't read those twice, because in between them there were emails from lawyers, reporters. A senator's assistant. Ethan's lawyer, the one who once refused our calls, reached out personally. We're reopening his case. The footage you shared changes everything. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I forwarded it to Ethan's old email, not even knowing if he could read it from a jail cell. Still, I hit send. The studio invited me back. I said no. I wasn't interested in becoming a story. I wanted justice, not a spotlight. Instead, I met with a legal team in a small office in downtown Coeur d'Alene. 3 women sat across from me. All former healthcare attorneys. All skeptical at first. But when I handed them the flash drive and the signed consent form and the letter from Dr. Reed, something shifted. Their expressions sharpened. Their questions got precise. How many others were in the trial? Do you have confirmation of payment beyond the check scan? Is Dr. Reed willing to testify? I answered carefully. Honestly. They asked if I wanted to press charges against my parents. He hesitated. Not because I doubted they deserved it, but because part of me still craved their apology more than any court ruling. I want them held accountable, I finally said. But I don't need to see them in prison. I need them exposed. The oldest attorney nodded. Exposure can be its own kind of justice. They took my case. Pro bono. Later that night, I sat on the cabin porch, phone in hand, debating whether to call Ethan's jail. I didn't want to hear his voice through static. Didn't want the cold reminder of bars between us. But I called anyway. He sounded tired, but when I told him about the show about the lawyers, his voice cracked. "You did it," he whispered. "No," I said. "We did." The fire inside the cabin flickered behind me. But I stayed outside, letting the cold bite just enough to keep me awake. I was no longer waiting for someone to come save me. I was standing, shaking. But standing. I didn't expect to see her again. But there she was, Linda. Sitting alone on a bench outside the courthouse, her hair still neat, her coat pressed like she had something to prove. The lawyers had warned me. She may attend the preliminary hearing. No contact necessary. But fate didn't care about legal advice. I walked past her, trying not to look. But she spoke first. "Mara." I stopped, my grip tightened on the cane. She stood slowly, like her body weighed more than it used to. "You shouldn't be doing this," she said. Her voice was familiar. Too familiar. It hadn't aged, it hadn't cracked. "You mean seeking justice?" I asked. She shook her head. "You're digging up things that should have stayed buried. We were trying to help you." I laughed. Soft. Flat. "You helped yourself to $7,000. You helped yourselves to silence." Her jaw clenched. The same way it always had when someone challenged her spreadsheet. "We were scared," she said. "Do you think it was easy watching you fall apart? The tremors, the expenses." "I wasn't an expense," I cut in. "I was your daughter." She flinched. But only for a second. Her eyes hardened. "We did what we could. What we thought was right." I looked at her, really looked. The woman who once packed my school lunches. Who held my hand through flu seasons. Who now couldn't hold eye contact for more than 3 seconds. "You left me in the rain, Mom," I said, "and now it's public. You don't get to rewrite that." She glanced away, lips thin. "You always had a flair for drama." My voice went low. "And you always had a flair for disappearing when it mattered." A bailiff opened the courthouse doors. I turned to go. But before I stepped inside, I looked back one last time. "I'm not here for revenge," I said. "I'm here for the truth. If that scares you, maybe it should." She didn't answer. Didn't follow. She just sat back down. Alone. Inside the courtroom, Ethan was there wearing borrowed clothes, his wrists free of cuffs. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The judge called our case. The lawyers stood, and for the first time I did too. Not because I was strong, not because I was healed, but because I had finally stopped apologizing for surviving what they couldn't even admit happened. Chuanji, 6, her turn to speak. Part 1/3, 502, 2. The news didn't die down. If anything, it grew louder. Headlines, podcasts, op-eds titled things like, "When Family Becomes the First Betrayal," and "The Neurovance Cover-Up No One Saw Coming." I watched the chaos from a small screen. A borrowed laptop. A cracked phone. They said my voice shook the system. But at night in Ethan's cabin, I still shook alone. The court hearings were scheduled. Depositions began. Subpoenas were issued. Linda, Robert, even Dr. Reed. And then someone leaked Ethan's dashcam footage. The one from the night they left me. It aired everywhere. I didn't watch it again. I couldn't. But I heard it twice while waiting in a coffee shop line. Someone behind me whispered, "That's her. The one they abandoned." I stood straighter. Not in pride. In defiance. I would not bow again. Still, the exposure was exhausting. Every message that called me brave was followed by one that called me a liar. Every email from a lawyer came with another reminding me how long the process would take. That justice was slow. That closure wasn't guaranteed. And in the middle of it, I was asked to speak. At a conference for medical ethics. Nothing televised. Just doctors. Policy writers, students. I said yes. Because silence had protected them long enough. The night before my speech, I practiced alone. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror wearing the only blazer I owned, my cane leaning against the sink. I practiced saying my own name. Saying I was betrayed, saying I survived. My reflection looked tired. But steady. I turned off the light. Went to bed fully dressed. When I walked into the conference hall, the next day, every seat was filled. I saw Dr. Helen Reed in the third row. She gave me a single nod, nothing more. A silent acknowledgement that what had once been buried was now undeniable. I stepped up to the podium. Took the mic. My voice trembled once. Only once. And then I began. I'm not a scientist, I began. I don't have a degree in pharmacology. I can't tell you how neuroscience was built molecule by molecule. But I can tell you how it broke me. A few heads turned. Some pens stopped scribbling. I was 26 when the tremors started. By 35, I was unemployed, uninsured, and considered a financial burden by the people who raised me. I paused. My parents enrolled me in a clinical trial without my knowledge. They forged my name. They accepted payment. And when the side effects came, when my body became inconvenient, they left me on the side of a road in the rain. Silence. No shifting chairs, no coughs, just stillness. Dr. Reed looked down at her notebook. I wondered what she was writing. Maybe the truth. Maybe just her shame. I continued. I've spent years thinking the damage was my fault. That I was weak. That I was too much. Too expensive, too broken. I looked across the room. But that's what systems like this are designed to do. They don't just hurt your body, they make you doubt your right to speak about it. I held up the letter from Dr. Reed. My story isn't unique. It's just public. And that makes it powerful. A few people nodded. A woman in the second row wiped her eye. A young man near the aisle stopped typing, fingers frozen above his laptop. I finished. You can talk about ethics in theory, or you can talk about what it feels like to be erased. I am here because I refuse to stay quiet. The applause didn't come right away. It built slowly. Not a standing ovation, but something quieter, deeper. Like recognition. Afterward, people approached me one by one. Doctors, students. One nurse who whispered. They did something similar to my sister. Dr. Reed waited until the room had mostly cleared. I'll testify, she said softly. I looked at her, this woman who once signed off on silence. And now finally chose to break it. Thank you, I said. She didn't smile, but her eyes were wet. I left the building with my cane tapping a steady rhythm across the tile floor. Each step slower than I liked. But mine. For the first time, I wasn't limping behind anyone's story. I was leading my own. 2 days after the conference, Ethan called me. Not collect. Not from a guard's phone. From outside the courthouse. They dropped the charges, he said, voice sharp with disbelief. They said it was in the public interest not to proceed. I pressed the phone to my ear with both hands. You're free, I whispered. I'm standing in the parking lot, he laughed. I'm cold, I'm hungry. But, yeah, free. I couldn't speak. Not for a moment. I just closed my eyes and let the relief melt into my spine. You did this, he added. Don't say you didn't, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Like a bridge had held beneath my weight when I thought it would crack. We agreed to meet the next day. I spent the afternoon at the cabin, sweeping the floors, boiling potatoes, folding the same blanket 3 times just to feel useful. At dusk, a courier knocked on the door. He handed me an envelope, no return address. But I knew that handwriting. Slanted. Precise. Tense. It was from Robert. I waited until the cabin was quiet. until the wind outside died down and the kettle hissed on the stove. Then I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. Mara, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve to be heard. But I want to tell you what I couldn't back then. Your mother and I were scared. Not just of the illness, but of what it revealed. That we had no control, that we could not fix you, that maybe we had broken something in you we didn't understand. We took money. We told ourselves it was for your care. We convinced ourselves it was a form of love. It wasn't. You deserved better, you still do. Your brother never gave up on you. I see that now. I hope you see it too. Dad, I read it twice. Then folded it carefully. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I placed the letter in a drawer with Dr. Reed's and shut it slowly. Ethan came home just before midnight. His boots were muddy. His jacket smelled like wind and smoke. He didn't speak, he just hugged me. And this time I didn't shake. Would you accept that letter or burn it? Can regret ever undo betrayal? Tell me where you're listening from. Has someone ever said too late to you? Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of justice, closure, and empowerment after 35. We didn't plan a press event. But the media came anyway. They camped outside the courthouse in folding chairs, press passes swinging from lanyards, cameras aimed like rifles at the entrance doors. Some shouted my name as I walked past. Others whispered it like a confession. I kept my eyes forward. Ethan walked beside me. Doctor. Helen Reed followed close behind, her shoes too thin for the icy pavement, but her steps never faltered. This wasn't a trial, not yet. It was a public hearing, an opening salvo. A chance to present the facts. To let the world hear what had been kept quiet for too long. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers. Court officers leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And across the aisle, Linda. She didn't look at me, not once. She wore a pale gray blazer. Not the color of guilt, but of someone hoping to disappear into the backdrop. Robert wasn't there. Word was he'd fled to stay with a cousin in Oregon. Couldn't handle the spectacle. I sat down. Adjusted the microphone in front of me. My hands trembled, but I left them visible. Let them see what silence cost me. The lead attorney rose first. He listed our claims: medical fraud, parental negligence, criminal misrepresentation. Then he opened a folder and held up the consent form. This is not her handwriting, he said. And this signature was fabricated. He pointed to Linda. She signed for her daughter. Then accepted money to remain quiet. Gasps. Flashes of cameras. I didn't move. Then it was my turn. I stood. The cane made a soft knock against the wood floor. My name is Mara Thompson, I said. My parents enrolled me in a medical trial I didn't agree to. When my condition worsened, they left me in the middle of nowhere. To die. Because they didn't want to deal with me anymore. I looked at Linda. She finally looked back. And for the first time, I didn't see power. I saw someone cornered by their own choices. I pulled a folded letter from my coat. My father sent this 2 nights ago. He admitted everything. And still he didn't show up today. I placed the letter on the table. Right next to the forged signature. The judge nodded slowly. We will reconvene after review. All evidence is now on record. As I turned to leave, the courtroom didn't erupt. It stayed silent. Which for once felt like respect. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned gray. Not the soft, sleepy gray of snow, but the sharp, metallic gray of headlines about to drop. Cameras followed us down the steps. Microphones jutted toward my face. Do you forgive your parents? Will you sue the company directly? Is this about money or justice? Ethan stepped between me and the crowd. We've said what we needed to in court. But they kept pushing. Someone shouted, "Were you complicit, Mr. Thompson?" He froze, then turned. I left home at 18, he said. Because I couldn't watch them erase her anymore. That shut them up just long enough for us to reach the car. Inside, I exhaled, a slow, bitter breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked. "No," I said, "but I'm not afraid anymore." We drove back to the cabin in silence. Snow had started falling fine and fast like dust shaken from a forgotten ceiling. On the porch a woman was waiting. Mid-50s. Blonde hair tied in a loose bun, a leather messenger bag clutched to her chest. Ethan slowed the truck. I narrowed my eyes. "I know her," I whispered. It was Claire Maxwell, former lead nurse for Neurovance Phase 2. We had seen her name once buried in a staff directory Ethan found online. But new photo. New contact. Until now. She approached as we stepped out. "I saw the broadcast," she said. And I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Her voice trembled. "Not from cold. I was there the day they altered your records. I told them it was wrong. They told me to leave. I signed an NDA. But I can't sleep anymore." She reached into her bag. Pulled out a worn leather folder. Inside copies of patient logs, clinical notes, email printouts, and a handwritten page. My name. My symptoms. The dosage amount. The note at the bottom stopped my breath. Patient exhibiting adverse response. Suggest immediate withdrawal from trial. "Maxwell," I looked at her. "You tried." She nodded. "I did. But I didn't try hard enough." She handed me the folder. "I'm ready to testify. NDA or not." Ethan stepped closer. "Why now?" She didn't hesitate. "Because you were brave, and I wasn't." We invited her inside. And as the fire crackled back to life, I realized we weren't just collecting evidence anymore. We were collecting people. People who had been silent. People who had been scared. People who finally chose to stand. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from something harder to explain. A strange quiet inside me. Not peace exactly, but something close. I sat by the window watching snow fall against pine branches. The wind whistled through the chimney. Ethan was asleep on the couch. Claire lay on the cot, hands clasped over her chest like she was guarding something fragile. On the table the folder sat open. The notes she gave us, the record of my name scrawled in clinical shorthand. I picked up my sketchpad. The pages were stiff from cold, but I found a blank one and began to write. Not to Linda, not to Robert. Not even to Dr. Reed or Claire. To myself. Dear Mara, you've been called dramatic, ungrateful, sick, unstable, and worse. You've been left in the rain and buried in paperwork. But here you are still speaking. You don't need their apology to know your worth. You don't need a verdict to know you were wronged. What you need is already here, your voice, your truth, your people. You are not weak. You are what they feared most, undeniable. And tomorrow you walk into court not for revenge, but for every woman who was told she was just imagining it. I tore the page out, folded it, and slipped it between the court documents. Let them find it someday. Let them know this wasn't just about evidence. It was about reclamation. I crawled under the blanket and let the fire's warmth find my spine. I slept. No tremors. No flashbacks. No voices whispering what I should have done differently. Just stillness. The kind that comes after a storm. When the air is clean. And everything damaged is finally visible but no longer hidden. The courtroom was packed. Not just with lawyers and reporters this time, but with people. Some held notebooks, some clutched tissues. A few just stared at me like I was a headline come to life. I didn't wear black, I wore blue. Soft navy. The color of quiet storms and deep water. Ethan adjusted my coat collar before we walked in. You don't have to be perfect, he whispered. Just honest. I nodded. My cane tapped against the polished floor with each step. Each sound louder than I expected. But I didn't try to silence it. It was mine. Like the tremor, like the truth. Linda sat 3 rows behind us. Alone. Her face pale, hands clasped in her lap like a child waiting for punishment. Dr. Reed was already on the witness stand. Her voice clear, steady, unwavering. She admitted what she knew, what she'd tried to flag, what they'd told her to bury. The judge leaned in, took notes, asked pointed questions. Then Claire took the stand. Her hands shook, but her voice it didn't. I was instructed to alter patient notes, to mislabel side effects, to delete flags raised during dosage testing, she said. One of the jurors gasped. The prosecutor paused, then asked, "Were any of those patients still enrolled in the program?" Claire looked at me. Yes. Mara Thompson was one of them. My name hung in the air. No longer just a victim. Now evidence. Then, it was my turn. I stood slowly, walked to the witness box, swore to tell the truth, though I had been doing that all along. The attorney's questions were careful, structured, but my answers weren't. They came out raw. I was sick and scared. And instead of helping me, my parents sold my future for a check. I held up the forged consent form. This isn't just paper. It's the moment I stopped being seen as a daughter and became disposable. I looked toward the jury. And I'm here not to beg for sympathy, but to demand truth. For myself, and for the others who can't be in this room. The judge called for recess, but no one moved. Silence stretched across the room like a held breath. When I stepped down, I saw Linda bow her head. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the girl in the rain anymore. I felt like someone who had made it back from the edge and brought the truth with her. After I stepped down, Ethan took the stand. He didn't dress for the cameras. No tie. No polished shoes. Just a worn button-up and the fire in his voice. I left that house because I knew something was broken, he said. But I didn't know how deep it went until I saw the footage. Until I read the trial paperwork. He glanced at the prosecutor. Then at me. She was never a burden. She was proof that my parents loved money more than they loved the truth. The courtroom held its breath again. Linda stared at the floor. And when the defense tried to object, tried to shift the narrative toward parental concern, the judge silenced them with a single wave of her hand. "We've heard enough theory," she said. "Now we're listening to lived experience." Outside, the story had already exploded. Social media was split. Number justice for Mara, number false victim, number quiet survivor, number fraud or family. I didn't read the comments anymore, but Ethan did. "They're scared," he told me. Because this time the villain wasn't a stranger. It was someone's mother. Someone's father. News vans circled the courthouse. Talk shows speculated on the implications for medical consent law. Whistleblower groups started using my name. I didn't ask for that. I just wanted the truth on record, where it couldn't be deleted or denied. The judge announced that closing arguments would begin the next day. We drove home through falling snow, the tires crunching on gravel like breaking glass. In the cabin, I boiled water for tea, my movements slower than usual. Ethan sat by the fire. "Do you think we'll win?" he asked. I sipped from my mug before answering. "I don't know," I said. "But I don't feel invisible anymore." He nodded. "That's something." That night, I got an email from a woman in Vermont. She said she'd watched the live feed with her daughter. That she'd been in a trial once. That no one believed her. Until now. "I don't want money," she wrote. "I just want to thank you for not going away." I sat with that line for a long time. Not going away. How many times had I been expected to shrink, to disappear, to collapse quietly in the corners of someone else's story? But here I was, still standing. And tomorrow, the world would hear the last word, not from them, but from me. The courtroom was quiet as the judge returned. People rose, then sat again. Even the air seemed to hesitate. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and began. "In the matter of fraudulent enrollment in human clinical trials, in the matter of forged consent and misrepresentation, in the matter of ethical violations from both family and corporate parties, this court finds the evidence substantial and credible." She turned to the rows behind me, to where Linda sat unmoving. Mrs. Thompson, the judge, said your actions were not just negligent, they were calculated. You prioritized compensation over the well-being of your own child. A murmur ran through the gallery. Linda didn't flinch, didn't blink. She just stared ahead stone still. The judge continued. While criminal sentencing will proceed under federal review, this court recommends full release of records and encourages federal agencies to open formal investigations against Neurovance Inc. and all clinical partners involved in Phase 2 trials. I exhaled slowly. Not triumph, but confirmation. It was real. It was named. It was no longer mine to carry in secret. Then came the final words. The court formally recognizes Mara Thompson as a survivor of unethical medical experimentation and familial abandonment. A new kind of silence filled the room, one that sounded like restoration. Not applause, not spectacle. Just truth finally made legal. I turned. Looked at Linda one last time. She still didn't look back. And that was her sentence, to live in the shadow of the truth she tried to erase. Outside reporters swarmed. I said nothing. Ethan held my coat. Claire stood behind us, clutching her folder like armor. We walked past them all. Into snow. Into air that didn't weigh as much anymore. That night, Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table again. We didn't talk about the verdict. We just sat. Hands wrapped around mugs of tea. Steam rising in silence. I reached for a pen. Opened my sketchpad, and on the first blank page I wrote, "Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it's just finally being believed." 3 months passed. The trial faded from headlines. Neurovance collapsed within weeks. Its CEO resigned, stockholders jumped ship, and lawsuits flooded in from families who had never spoken up before. We were no longer the only story. And strangely, I found peace in that. In no longer being the face of pain, Ethan and I stayed in the cabin. He fixed a broken window in the back room. I painted the kitchen walls a soft yellow. Claire visited often. Sometimes to help organize medical documents for other victims. Sometimes just to sit with me in silence, 2 women relearning how to breathe in spaces that didn't hurt. One morning I received a letter from a high school in Montana. A teacher had shown a clip of my court testimony to her senior ethics class. 22 students had written back. Some said thank you. Some said they cried. One girl wrote, "You made me feel less alone in my own family." I kept her letter on the fridge. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that surviving isn't selfish, it's service. I still had tremors. They didn't go away. But I stopped hiding them. When I signed receipts, I let the pen wobble. When I raised a mug, I held it with both hands, not from shame but steadiness. The world didn't change overnight. But my corner of it did. In June, Ethan and I sat under the porch roof during a rainstorm. He handed me a folder. Inside, an application form. Federal registration for a nonprofit. At the top, the Second Chance Foundation. A support network for survivors of unethical clinical testing and medical coercion. I blinked. He smiled. We've got funds, media attention. Lawyers offering pro bono support. Might as well use the fire while it's still burning. I traced the title with my thumb. Underneath it in smaller print was the phrase I had once written in my notebook. "You are what they fear most, undeniable." I didn't cry. Not then. I just nodded. And signed. We mailed it the next day. The world wouldn't remember every headline. They never do. But I would remember the rain. The night I was left with nothing. And how that silence became the root of something louder, lasting. In late September, I returned to Denver. Just for a weekend. The city hadn't changed much. But I had. I stood outside my old apartment building for a long time, watching someone else's curtains ripple behind windows that once framed my fear. The bakery across the street still sold the same cinnamon rolls. Same clerk. Same chipped counter. But this time when she handed me my order, she looked up and said, "I saw you on the news." I braced for judgment. But she just smiled. "Good for you." I walked along 14th Avenue past the clinic where I used to wait for appointments that never gave me answers. Past the bus stop I stood at in winter hands, raw from cold, pretending everything was fine. I stopped by the park. The same bench, the same fountain, the same parents chasing toddlers across soft grass. I sat. Let the wind braid itself through my hair. Out of habit, I reached into my bag and pulled out my sketch pad. Not to write. Not to explain. Just to draw. I let the lines shake. Didn't try to straighten them. The trees came out crooked, the clouds uneven. But the page filled anyway. Behind me someone laughed, light and far away. I smiled. As I left the park, I passed a mural. It hadn't been there before. A woman, her eyes closed, head tilted upward. Beneath her chin, painted in thick looping letters, "Your survival is your protest." I stopped walking. Read it twice. Then once more. Later that night back in the cabin, I told Ethan about it. He didn't say much, just leaned back in his chair and said, "Sounds like something you'd write." Maybe it was. Or maybe someone else had walked through fire and found something worth saying at the end of it. We don't always get justice in courtrooms, but sometimes justice is a life rebuilt. A voice no longer shaking. A foundation that didn't exist until you stood on it. I don't need revenge. I don't need their names on a verdict. What I need, what I've built, is mine. Quiet, undeniable, and finally free. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in mid-October, covering the cabin roof in a quiet white blanket. Ethan stocked the firewood. I made soup that steamed up the kitchen windows, and for the first time in years we made plans. Not escape plans, not crisis plans, but future ones. We decided to use part of the settlement money not for ourselves but for others who had no cabin, no brother, no folder of evidence. We called it the Dignity Project. Not a charity, not a brand. Just a commitment. To restore what had been quietly stolen from people like me. Dignity, agency. Their own damn name on their own damn documents. We built a small team: Claire, 2 legal interns from Oregon, a trauma counselor named Neva who offered free sessions to women emerging from toxic families. Every Friday we opened the inbox, stories poured in. A woman from Wisconsin whose husband tricked her into medical debt. A former nursing student who was expelled after refusing to falsify dosage data. A retired vet tech whose tremors were misdiagnosed for 10 years until a trial emerged. Some days I had to close the laptop and walk into the woods. Not to escape, but to remember that I was no longer alone inside those stories. One afternoon in November, Ethan knocked on the cabin door. "You've got a visitor." I stepped out. Linda stood near the truck. Her coat was too thin. She looked smaller, but not fragile, just worn. "I don't want anything," she said before I could speak. I nodded once. Neither of us moved closer. "I read the articles," she said quietly. "I watched the hearing. I waited. I was wrong," she added. "As a mother. As a human being." That line landed like a stone in my chest. Not because it was enough, but because she finally said it with no strings. She didn't cry, didn't beg, she just stood there in the cold. "I'm dying," she said. The words hit harder than I expected. Pancreatic. Stage 4. Too late for trial drugs. Too late for most things. "I didn't come for your forgiveness," she said. "I just needed you to know I remembered everything." I swallowed. My fingers curled around the porch railing. "I'm not angry anymore," I told her. "But I can't invite you back into my life." "I know," she said. She handed me a photo. From when I was 12. Smiling. Holding a ribbon from a school art fair. "I kept this," she said. "I didn't deserve to." She turned to go. I stopped her. "You did love me," I said softly. "Just not in the way I needed. And not when it counted." She nodded once. And then she left. I didn't cry. I just sat on the steps for a long time holding that photograph, wondering if closure always had to feel unfinished. In December, we launched our first in-person retreat. 10 women. 1 cabin. A week of no pressure to explain themselves. They painted, they screamed into pillows. They learned to say no and not apologize. I ran a session called Redrawing the Narrative. I gave them blank pages. One woman, Sandra, refused to draw. She said her ex-husband always called her handwriting messy. I told her messy hands tell honest stories. By the end of the week, she filled an entire notebook. Before she left, she hugged me. "You didn't save me," she said, "but you reminded me I could start saving myself." That was enough. I still tremble. I still have bad days. There are mornings my hands won't hold a cup without spilling and nights when I flinch at loud sounds I can't place. But I don't disappear inside those moments anymore. I stay. I breathe. And I reach. For paint. For paper. For purpose. One night sitting by the fire, Ethan asked, "Do you think you'll ever go back to Denver for good?" I shook my head. That city held too many ghosts. This place. It holds roots. He smiled. "You made something from ashes." "Not just me," I said. He nodded. Still, someone had to light the match. On the last day of the year, I stood alone on the porch. Snow falling in soft sheets. No camera, no judge. No enemy left to name. Just me. My cane. My voice. And the silence I had reclaimed as mine. I whispered the same words I wrote in my sketchpad months ago. Justice is not always loud. Then I added something new. Sometimes it's a woman standing in the snow, unafraid of what comes next. And for the first time, I believed every syllable. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of justice, closure, and empowerment after 35.